The prenuptial agreement sat in a safety deposit box, unsigned by James because Emma had told him it wasn't necessary, that she had nothing, a lie she'd maintained for 3 years of marriage. Unaware his pregnant wife is the secret trillionaire who owns the company that just hired him. The gala should have been Emma's triumph, her tech company's annual charity fundraiser, but she'd attended anonymously through a subsidiary representative while she stood in the back in a simple black dress, 6 months pregnant, watching James network with executives who reported to her shell corporations. The champagne toast was interrupted when Diane arrived on James's arm, his mistress wearing the diamond bracelet he'd bought with a credit card Emma paid off monthly. And the moment Diane recognized Emma near the dessert table, the performance began. The slap wasn't just physical, but theatrical, Diane's voice carrying across the ballroom as she accused Emma of stalking, of being unhinged, of trying to trap her husband. But the real devastation came when his mother joined in laughing, Rebecca's voice cutting through the shocked silence of San Francisco's elite, calling Emma a pathetic wannabe who would never fit into their family. The phone Emma pulled from her purse didn't capture the assault for police. It displayed a board resolution she'd drafted that morning, one that would dissolve the Martinez family trust, recall the corporate loans that funded their lifestyle, and expose every financial thread connecting their comfort to Emma's anonymous generosity. What happens when the people who promised to love you reveal they only loved what they thought they could take? How does a woman protect her unborn child when the father's family sees her as nothing more than an obstacle? And what remains when bankruptcy strips away the pretense and forces everyone to confront who they really are? Dear viewers, this is more than a revenge story. It's a masterclass in self-respect, strategic thinking, and the consequences of underestimating people. You'll learn why maintaining separate finances protects you, how building an empire requires sacrifice and secrecy, and why your reputation is built on actions, not assumptions. This story will show you the importance of documenting everything, choosing your battles wisely, and understanding that sometimes walking away is the most powerful move you can make. The narrative explores themes of betrayal, redemption, and the real meaning of family beyond blood and marriage. After watching, please share your perspective in the comments. What would you have done in Emma's situation? Would you have revealed your identity sooner or stayed hidden? What lessons about relationships and self-worth did you take from this story? Subscribe for more thought-provoking content that challenges you to think deeper about loyalty, justice, and the strength we all carry within. 3 years earlier, Emma had stood in a coffee shop wearing a Stanford hoodie and jeans with holes in the knees, her laptop displaying code that would eventually become the backbone of a financial technology empire worth $4.2 billion. But the man approaching her table saw only a graduate student struggling with her thesis. James Martinez had confidence that came from a trust fund and a mother who'd told him since childhood that he deserved the best of everything. But Emma saw something different in his smile, a loneliness that matched her own, a hunger for connection that money couldn't buy, and a vulnerability he hid behind designer watches and rehearsed charm. Their first conversation lasted 6 hours, but Emma made a decision in the first 6 minutes. She wouldn't tell him about the 17 patents she'd filed, the venture capital firms courting her startup, or the fact that the thesis on her screen was actually a pitch deck for technology that would revolutionize corporate banking infrastructure. The proposal came 8 months later on a beach in Monterey, but the ring James presented cost 3 months of his junior analyst salary, and Emma cried not because of the diamond's size, but because he'd sacrificed for her, because he'd chosen her without knowing about the offshore accounts, the shell corporations, or the fact that she'd already been featured in Forbes under a pseudonym. She told herself the secrecy was protection, protection from people who'd want her for her money, protection from the family dynamics that wealth destroyed, protection from becoming a target instead of a partner. But the truth was more complicated. Emma had watched her mother lose everything in a divorce where a prenup hadn't existed, had seen cousins torn apart by inheritance battles, and had learned early that love mixed with money created a poison that killed what was genuine and left only transaction. The wedding was small but expensive, funded by what James believed was Emma's modest savings from freelance coding work, but every vendor was actually a subsidiary of companies Emma controlled. Every discount a directive she'd sent through intermediaries, every detail managed by assistants who knew her real identity but had signed NDAs that could bankrupt them if violated. Rebecca Martinez had objected to the marriage from the beginning, her voice sharp at family dinners as she questioned Emma's background, her lack of family wealth, her state school undergraduate degree before Stanford, and the absence of country club connections that Rebecca valued more than character or intelligence. James would defend Emma weakly, his words supportive but his actions revealing the truth. He never confronted his mother directly, never set boundaries that mattered, never chose his wife over his family's approval in ways that required actual sacrifice. The pregnancy test showed positive on their second anniversary, but Emma's joy was complicated by the morning sickness that made coding difficult, and the realization that she'd soon have to make decisions about maternity leave from a company where she couldn't publicly acknowledge her CEO role. She'd built elaborate systems of management, trusted executives who ran operations, lawyers who handled board meetings in her name, financial structures so complex that even forensic accountants would need months to trace ownership back to her. But the architecture of deception was becoming exhausting. The baby growing inside her represented a deadline Emma hadn't anticipated. How long could she maintain the illusion before their daughter asked questions, before school forms required honest answers, before the weight of living a double life crushed what remained of her marriage? James's career had stalled at a mid-tier consulting firm, his performance reviews praising his presentation skills but noting a lack of strategic thinking that Emma recognized from their home life. He was excellent at looking successful, but struggled with the actual work that success required. She'd watched him blame colleagues for his failures, watched his resentment grow as former classmates leapfrogged him into senior positions, watched his need for validation make him vulnerable to flattery from anyone who noticed his expensive suits and assumed he had power. When Emma suggested he apply to Castellan Financial Group, she'd framed it as a random job posting she'd seen online, but the truth was more calculated. She'd instructed her head of HR to create a position tailored exactly to James's resume, to interview him alongside legitimate candidates to maintain the illusion, and to offer him a salary that would restore his confidence without raising suspicions about favoritism. The job offer had arrived 3 weeks ago, and James had celebrated like he'd won the lottery, his excitement genuine enough that Emma felt guilt mixing with her growing unease. He didn't know that Castellan Financial was wholly owned by Thornton Technologies, which was controlled by Apex Holdings, which was a subsidiary of Meridian Capital. All of them Emma's creations, all of them linked through structures designed specifically to hide her involvement. She'd given him the career boost he desperately needed, but she'd done it through manipulation rather than honesty, through control rather than partnership, and the foundation of their marriage was cracking under the weight of secrets that had seemed protective, but were actually corrosive. The real fracture had started small. Late nights, James explained, as client dinners, text messages he angled away from her view, a new cologne that smelled like someone else's choice rather than his usual brand, but Emma's resources made discovery inevitable. The private investigator's report sat in her encrypted email, photos of James with Diane Crawford, a marketing director at his old firm. Their affair spanning 7 months and including the weekend James had claimed was a bachelor party in Las Vegas, but was actually a couple's retreat in Napa Valley. Emma had stared at those photos for hours, her hand on her swollen belly, trying to reconcile the man who'd proposed on a beach with the man who was building a second life while she carried his child. The gala invitation had arrived in their mail with James's name embossed in gold, a +1 included, but Emma had told him she wasn't feeling well enough to attend, a lie that allowed her to watch what he'd do when he thought she wasn't looking. She'd stood in their bedroom doorway as he'd gotten ready, his reflection in the mirror showing excitement that hadn't been present in months, and when he'd kissed her forehead on his way out, she'd smelled perfume that wasn't hers lingering on his collar from what he'd claimed was a late afternoon at the office. The decision to attend separately had been strategic rather than emotional. Emma needed to see the full scope of what her marriage had become, needed to witness without the performance James put on when she was present, needed evidence of whether the man she'd married still existed beneath the layers of entitlement and deception. The Grand Pavilion ballroom glittered with San Francisco's power elite, but Emma entered through the service entrance wearing a simple black dress from Target and flats that wouldn't aggravate her swollen ankles, her hair pulled back in a style that made her forgettable among the elaborate updos and designer gowns filling the space. The event's purpose was raising money for STEM education for underprivileged youth, a cause Emma had funded to the tune of $50 million annually through various foundations. But tonight she wasn't the anonymous donor being thanked in speeches. She was the invisible pregnant woman standing near the kitchen doors, watching her husband laugh with executives who'd have fired him months ago if Emma hadn't sent directives through carefully constructed corporate channels. James stood near the open bar with 3 colleagues from Castellan Financial, his posture radiating confidence that came from his recent promotion to Senior Strategy Director, a title Emma had created specifically for him, complete with a corner office and a salary that made Rebecca's criticisms about his career finally stop. The promotion had come with responsibilities James was unequipped to handle, but Emma had assigned him a team of analysts who did the actual work while allowing him to present their findings as his own, a system that made him look competent while protecting the company from his limitations. She'd told herself this was love, protecting his ego, creating opportunities he couldn't generate himself, smoothing his path through a world that would have chewed him up otherwise. But standing there 6 months pregnant, watching him flirt with a woman in emerald silk, Emma recognized her actions for what they really were. Not love, but control. Not support, but enabling. Not partnership, but a transaction where she paid increasingly higher prices for diminishing returns. The woman in emerald was Diane Crawford, though Emma had known her face from surveillance photos long before tonight, and the way Diane touched James's arm wasn't the casual contact of colleagues, but the proprietary gesture of someone who believed she had claim to him. Diane's laugh carried across the ballroom, sharp and performative, designed to attract attention rather than express genuine amusement, and Emma watched James lean closer, his wedding ring catching light as he brushed a strand of hair from Diane's shoulder. The intimacy of the gesture hit Emma harder than the investigators' photos had. This wasn't hidden anymore. This was James parading his mistress at a company event, confident enough in his position that he didn't fear consequences, arrogant enough to believe Emma would never discover the truth. Rebecca Martinez's arrival shifted the energy in Emma's body from sadness to something colder and more calculating. James's mother swept into the ballroom wearing burgundy silk that probably cost more than most attendees' monthly rent, her neck dripping with diamonds that came from the family trust. Trust that existed only because Emma had anonymously purchased the Martinez family's failing textile business 3 years ago, restructured it through a private equity firm she controlled, and returned it to profitability while the family believed their own business acumen had saved them. Rebecca's eyes found her son immediately, but her expression when she spotted Diane wasn't disapproval but delight, and Emma watched in real time as Rebecca embraced the mistress with warmth she'd never shown her actual daughter-in-law. The three of them formed a triangle near the silent auction tables, Rebecca's hand on Diane's back as she introduced her to other guests, and Emma caught fragments of conversation that revealed this wasn't their first meeting. Rebecca was actively facilitating her son's affair, actively endorsing the woman replacing Emma, actively working to erase the pregnant wife who'd never been good enough for her precious son. The betrayal should have surprised Emma, but it didn't. Rebecca had made her feelings clear from the beginning through 1,000 small cruelties. The wrong name on Christmas cards, the family photos that somehow never included Emma, the constant comparisons to James's ex-girlfriend, whose father owned a yacht and a vineyard in Tuscany. Emma's phone buzzed with a text from her head of security. Target has been mobile for 7 minutes, approaching your section. She'd known Diane would eventually notice her. The investigators' report had detailed Diane's obsessive social media stalking of Emma's limited online presence, the drive-bys past their house, the questions Diane asked James's friends about his wife's weaknesses and vulnerabilities. What Emma hadn't anticipated was the speed with which politeness would shatter into violence. But when Diane's eyes locked on Emma standing alone near the dessert table, the mask of civility disappeared entirely. Diane crossed the ballroom with purpose, her heels clicking against marble, and the conversations around them began to pause as people sensed approaching conflict. Emma stood perfectly still, her hand instinctively protecting her belly, as Diane invaded her personal space with breath that smelled like champagne and entitlement. The words came first, loud enough for the surrounding crowd to hear, sharp enough to draw blood without leaving visible marks, accusations of stalking, of desperation, of trying to trap a man who'd clearly moved on to someone better, someone younger, someone who understood what a man like James really needed. Emma said nothing, her silence interpreted as weakness by Diane, but actually a choice, a decision to let her enemies reveal exactly who they were before she showed them who she'd always been. The slap wasn't a moment of lost control, but a calculated performance. Diane's palm connecting with Emma's cheek with force meant to humiliate rather than injure, and the sound echoed through the suddenly silent ballroom like a gunshot. Emma's head snapped to the side, her vision blurring for a moment, but she didn't raise her hand to her face, didn't cry out, didn't give Diane the satisfaction of a reaction beyond the tears that came involuntarily from the physical shock. The diamond bracelet on Diane's wrist, the one James had bought her with a credit card Emma paid off every month without comment, caught light as Diane raised her hand for another blow. But the second strike never came because Rebecca's laughter stopped her. James's mother had pulled out her phone, the camera pointed directly at Emma, recording what she clearly believed was her daughter-in-law's final humiliation. Rebecca's voice carried across the frozen ballroom as she narrated for her video. "This is the gold digger who trapped my son with a pregnancy, the nobody who thought she could social climb into our family, the pathetic wannabe who will never belong anywhere near people like us." The cruelty wasn't spontaneous but rehearsed, each word chosen for maximum damage, and Emma realized this had been planned. Diane's presence at the gala, the public confrontation, Rebecca's recording, all of it orchestrated to create a viral moment that would justify James leaving his pregnant wife for his mistress. Emma's hand moved to her purse not to retrieve tissues for her tears or a phone to call for help, but to access the device that controlled more wealth than everyone in this ballroom combined would earn in their lifetimes. The screen displayed the board resolution she'd drafted at 6 a.m. that morning, the document she'd hoped she wouldn't need to execute, the nuclear option she'd prepared because some part of her had known this moment was inevitable. Her finger hovered over the execute button as she looked across the ballroom at James, who stood frozen near the bar, his face showing shock but not the outrage a husband should feel watching his pregnant wife assaulted, not the protective fury that love should have generated, not even the basic decency to step between his mother and his wife. The choice became clear in that absence of action. Emma was alone, had always been alone, and would protect herself and her daughter the only way she knew how. With the empire she'd built in secret, with the power she'd never wanted to use, with the truth that would destroy everything James and his family believed about their world and their place in it. Emma's finger pressed the button with steady pressure that came from certainty rather than anger, and the resolution transmitted instantly to 17 different servers across 3 continents, initiating a cascade of automated processes that would take 72 hours to complete, but would begin showing effects within minutes. The phone in her hand became a weapon more devastating than anything physical, but Emma didn't announce what she'd done. Instead, she met Rebecca's camera lens with eyes that had stopped crying and started calculating, her voice quiet enough that the crowd leaned closer to hear, loud enough that her words would carry on Rebecca's own recording. "You should save that video. In 3 days, it'll be the only evidence that your family was ever this confident, this comfortable, this certain that the world owed you anything at all." The confusion on Rebecca's face was almost satisfying. But Emma wasn't performing for James's mother. She was speaking to the daughter growing inside her, creating a record of the moment her mother chose self-preservation over silence, chose truth over a marriage that had been built on quicksand and held together by Emma's money and patience. Diane's second slap never came, because Emma stepped forward instead of retreating, moving into Diane's space with the confidence of someone who'd stopped pretending to be powerless and started owning the power she'd always possessed. "That bracelet you're wearing, the one James bought you for your birthday last month? I paid for it. The card he used links to an account I fund. You've been wearing my generosity while disrespecting me, and that ends tonight." Diane's laugh was uncertain now, her eyes darting to James for confirmation that this pregnant woman in a Target dress was delusional, but James's expression had shifted from shock to something that looked like dawning horror, as though pieces he'd never thought to connect were suddenly forming a picture he didn't want to see. Emma continued, her voice gaining strength as the ballroom's attention focused entirely on her, as phones appeared in hands to record what was clearly becoming a moment none of these people would forget. "James, do you remember when you asked me why I didn't want a prenup? You thought it was because I was romantic, because I trusted you completely, because I believed love was enough. The truth is simpler. I didn't need a prenup because I have nothing to protect from you. You have everything to lose from me." The specific revelations came methodically, each one a hammer blow to the fantasy James had constructed. The job at Castellan Financial wasn't earned through his interviews, but created specifically for him. The promotion to Senior Strategy Director was Emma protecting him from termination after his disastrous presentation to the Tokyo office had nearly cost the company a $200 million contract. The analysts on his team weren't selected by HR, but handpicked by Emma to make him look competent while they did the actual strategic work. James's face drained of color as Emma spoke, but she wasn't finished because the crowd deserved to understand the full scope of the deception, deserved to know that the confident man they'd been networking with all night was essentially a well-compensated intern playing dress-up in a corner office. Rebecca's phone had lowered slightly, the video still recording, but Rebecca's hands shaking now, and Emma turned her attention to the woman who'd made 3 years of family dinners into exercises in psychological warfare, who'd questioned Emma's education despite Stanford credentials, who'd implied Emma had trapped James with pregnancy when James had been the one pushing to start a family. "Rebecca, the textile business you're so proud of saving, the one you tell everyone proves the Martinez family's business genius, it was bankrupt when I bought it through Meridian Capital 3 years ago. Every dividend you've received, every board seat you've claimed, every business award you've accepted, all of it exists because I restructured your family's failing company and returned it to profitability, while letting you believe you'd done it yourselves." The ballroom had gone completely silent except for the click of phone cameras and the rustle of expensive fabric as people shifted to get better angles. But Emma wasn't playing to the crowd. She was speaking to the three people who'd humiliated her, betrayed her, and underestimated her. The executive from Castellan Financial that James had been networking with earlier stepped forward, his expression professional but confused, and Emma recognized Daniel Chen, her actual chief strategy officer, the man she'd hired away from Goldman Sachs 2 years ago with a compensation package that made headlines in industry publications. "Ms. Thornton, we weren't expecting you to attend tonight. Should I?" The name hung in the air like a bomb with a visible timer, and Emma watched realization spread across James's face as he connected Thornton Technologies, the company whose gala this was. To Thornton, the name Emma had told him was her middle name. To the woman standing in front of him who he'd thought was a freelance coder, struggling to make rent when they'd met. Daniel's use of Mrs. Thornton rather than Mistress Martinez wasn't accidental. Emma had never changed her name legally, never filed the paperwork that would link her married identity to her corporate empire, never given James access to the truth of who she was because some instinct had told her to keep escape routes open. "Daniel, please continue with the evening's program. I'll handle this privately." Emma's voice carried the authority of someone used to giving orders that affected thousands of employees and billions in assets, and the transformation from invisible pregnant woman to corporate titan was so complete that several people in the crowd actually stepped back. James tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came because what could he possibly say that would undo the discovery that his entire adult life had been funded, facilitated, and essentially fictional? The wife he'd cheated on wasn't a nobody clinging to his success. She was the reason he had any success to begin with. And the mistress he'd chosen over her was wearing jewelry purchased with Emma's money to celebrate an affair Emma had known about for months, but had allowed to continue while she prepared for exactly this moment. Rebecca's recovery was faster than James's, her social conditioning kicking in to save face even as her world crumbled, her voice attempting the imperious tone that had worked on Emma for 3 years but now sounded hollow and desperate. "This is absurd. You expect us to believe that you, a girl with no family, no connections, no background, somehow built a technology empire, that you're the Thornton everyone talks about?" James would have known. He would have what, Rebecca? Loved me for myself if he'd known, or loved me for my money. That's exactly why I never told him. I wanted to know what James would do with a wife he thought was ordinary, how he'd treat me when he believed I had nothing to offer except myself, whether his love was real or transactional. Tonight answered those questions definitively. Emma's hand moved to her belly, protecting the daughter who would grow up knowing the truth about her father, about the grandmother who'd rather film cruelty than stop it, about the choices that define character more clearly than any amount of wealth or status. The security team Emma had positioned throughout the ballroom moved into formation, not threatening but present, and the head of her detail appeared at her elbow with a quiet question about whether she needed medical attention after the assault. Emma declined but accepted the offered tablet, pulling up documents that would become public record within hours. The dissolution of the Martinez family trust, the recall of all corporate loans extended to Rebecca's textile business, the termination letter for James effective immediately, and the restraining order that would prevent any of them from coming within 500 feet of Emma or her daughter once she was born. Each document bore Emma's signature, her real legal name fully displayed, and the date stamps showed they'd all been drafted before tonight's gala, before the confrontation, before Emma had given them one final chance to choose differently. James found his voice finally, and it cracked with something that might have been genuine emotion or might have been panic at watching his lifestyle evaporate in real time. "Emma, please, I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, but we can fix this. We can go to counseling. I'll end things with Diane. I'll do whatever you want. Just please don't do this. Don't destroy everything because of one mistake." The desperation in his words would have moved Emma 6 months ago, but 6 months ago she hadn't been standing in a ballroom watching her husband's mother film her humiliation. 6 months ago she hadn't known the full extent of his betrayal. 6 months ago she'd still believed love could overcome fundamental incompatibility of character and values. "One mistake, James? Your affair started 7 months ago. You took Diane to Napa the weekend you told me was a bachelor party. You've been using my money to fund a second relationship while I carried your child. Your mother has been undermining our marriage from day one, and you never once chose me over her approval. You proposed with a ring you could barely afford because you wanted me when you thought I was ordinary, but you resented me when you thought I was beneath you. The mistake wasn't yours tonight. The mistake was mine 3 years ago when I convinced myself that hiding who I was would protect what we had, when the truth is we never had anything real to protect." Emma's voice didn't break because she'd cried all her tears in private, had grieved the marriage alone in their home, while James was creating memories with Diane, had already mourned what she was ending here tonight. The tablet in her hand displayed one final document, and Emma turned it so James could see the custody agreement she'd filed that afternoon, one that would give him visitation rights but no decision-making power, that would require supervised exchanges and documented child support payments, that would protect her daughter from the chaos of the Martinez family while still allowing a relationship with her father if he chose to be present. "You can be part of our daughter's life if you're willing to show up consistently, honestly, and without the entourage of people who've proven they don't have her best interests at heart. But you'll do it on terms that protect her, and you'll do it knowing that every interaction will be documented and every promise will be held accountable. That's what real love looks like, James. It protects the vulnerable, even from their own family." 72 hours after the gala, Emma sat in her actual office, the corner suite on the 43rd floor of Thornton Tower that overlooked San Francisco Bay, watching news coverage of what financial journalists were calling the Martinez family collapse. But her attention kept drifting to the ultrasound image on her desk, showing her daughter's profile, the curve of a tiny nose that looked like Emma's own, a reminder of why exposure had been necessary, even when it hurt. The automated systems she'd triggered had worked exactly as designed. The family trust dissolution had revealed that Rebecca's personal wealth was entirely dependent on corporate structures Emma controlled. The loan recalls had forced the sale of the Martinez family home in Pacific Heights and the vacation property in Cabo, and James's termination had been followed by a detailed internal audit that exposed years of work attributed to him that had actually been produced by the analysts Emma had assigned to protect him from his own incompetence. The phone on her desk showed 47 missed calls from James, 12 from Rebecca, and hundreds from journalists wanting interviews about the tech titan who'd been hiding in plain sight. But Emma had responded to none of them because her energy was focused on building the life her daughter deserved, rather than explaining herself to people who'd had 3 years to see her clearly and had chosen blindness instead. Her attorney had called that morning to report that James had hired a divorce lawyer, expensive but not experienced in high net worth cases, suggesting he still didn't fully grasp the financial reality he was facing, and that Rebecca was attempting to sue for fraudulent inducement regarding the textile business purchase, a lawsuit that would fail because every transaction had been documented, legitimate, and executed through proper corporate channels with no misrepresentation of any kind. The real surprise had come from Diane, whose social media accounts had been deleted within 24 hours of the gala, whose employment at her marketing firm had been terminated for conduct unbecoming after video of her assaulting a pregnant woman went viral, and who'd attempted to reach Emma through intermediaries with apologies that sounded more like fear of legal consequences than genuine remorse. Emma had instructed her attorney to proceed with assault charges, regardless of any apology, because her daughter needed to grow up in a world where violence against pregnant women carried actual consequences, where public humiliation wasn't entertainment, and where accountability wasn't negotiable just because someone regretted getting caught. The criminal case would be straightforward: multiple witnesses, clear video evidence, and Diane's own words recorded on Rebecca's phone before Rebecca had realized the video would incriminate rather than vindicate. The knock on Emma's office door interrupted her thoughts, and she looked up to see Daniel Chen with a tablet and an expression that mixed concern with professional efficiency. "The board meeting is ready whenever you are. They're asking about your plans for the Castellan division now that the senior strategy director position is vacant." The corporate machinery had continued without pause despite the personal chaos. Earnings reports still needed reviewing, product launches still required approval, acquisition targets still demanded evaluation, but Emma had built systems resilient enough to withstand her temporary distraction, had surrounded herself with executives competent enough to manage operations while she dealt with the implosion of her marriage. "Tell them I'll be there in 10 minutes. And Daniel, let's restructure that entire division, create a legitimate mentorship program for young analysts who show potential but need development. If we're going to give people opportunities, let's do it honestly instead of creating fake positions to protect egos." Emma's voice carried lessons learned at enormous personal cost. The realization that helping James by hiding reality hadn't helped him at all. That genuine support required honesty, even when honesty was uncomfortable. That love without respect was just elaborate enabling dressed up as sacrifice. The daughter she'd raise would understand that her worth wasn't dependent on making herself small for someone else's comfort. That building an empire in secret wasn't necessary when you refused to date men who needed you to be less than you were. That the right partner would celebrate your success rather than require you to hide it. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, but the message content made the sender obvious. "I know I have no right to ask, but can we talk? Not about money or the divorce or any of that. About our daughter. About whether there's any chance you'll let me be more than a supervised visitation in her life. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I'm asking for a chance to prove I can be better than I was. James." The vulnerability in the message was more genuine than anything James had said at the gala. But Emma had learned that vulnerability after consequences wasn't the same as character. That regret about outcomes wasn't the same as remorse about choices. That wanting a relationship with his daughter because he'd lost everything else wasn't the same as being emotionally equipped to be a good father. Emma's response was measured but not cruel. "Our daughter deserves a father who shows up consistently, who does the work of personal growth without shortcuts or handlers making him look better than he is, who understands that being a parent is about her needs rather than your redemption arc. If you're serious about being in her life, prove it through actions over time rather than words right now. Enroll in therapy, take parenting classes, build a life that's stable and honest. Do that for 6 months while I'm on maternity leave, and we'll discuss expanded visitation. But understand this clearly, I will protect her from chaos, inconsistency, and people who love the idea of her more than they're willing to do the actual work of loving her well." The text sent with a soft whoosh, and Emma silenced her phone because James's journey toward becoming a decent father wasn't her responsibility to manage. She'd spent 3 years trying to manage his journey toward being a decent husband, and that had accomplished nothing except delaying the inevitable while costing her self-respect. The view from her office showed the city she'd conquered while pretending to be invisible. The skyline dotted with buildings housing companies that used her technology. The bay reflecting afternoon light that made everything look possible in the way that only California sunshine could. Emma's hand moved to her belly where her daughter was moving, tiny kicks that felt like messages from the future, and she made promises in the silence of her office that this child would never watch her mother shrink, never learn that love required self-erasure, never believe that success was something to apologize for or hide. The empire Emma had built would become her daughter's inheritance, but more important than the wealth would be the lesson that a woman could be both powerful and kind, both successful and loving, both strategic and genuine, without needing anyone's permission or approval. The final piece of the puzzle arrived via email from her estate attorney, the trust documents for her daughter, structures that would protect her inheritance from anyone who might try to exploit her, education funds that would give her choices Emma herself had fought for, and a foundation in her name that would fund STEM education for girls who deserved opportunities regardless of their families, wealth, or connections. The irony wasn't lost on Emma. She'd spent 3 years hiding her success from James while secretly funding his lifestyle. But she'd spend the rest of her life teaching her daughter to be proud of her accomplishments, to build things in her own name, to choose partners who celebrated her, rather than requiring her diminishment. Rebecca's lawyer had sent a cease and desist letter demanding Emma stop defaming the Martinez family in the press, apparently unaware that Emma had said nothing publicly, that the media coverage was based entirely on public corporate filings and the viral video Rebecca herself had recorded, that the reputation destruction was self-inflicted rather than Emma's revenge. The letter went into Emma's attorney's hands with instructions to respond professionally but firmly. All statements made at the gala were factually accurate and provable through documentation. The video evidence was Rebecca's own creation and thus couldn't constitute defamation when shared by third parties, and any further contact should go through legal counsel rather than attempting to reach Emma directly. The Martinez family's desire to control the narrative after losing control of everything else was predictable, but Emma had learned that people who refused accountability would always blame others for consequences they'd created themselves. The board meeting went smoothly because Emma's executives had learned over the years that she valued honesty over optimism, that problems presented early could be solved, while problems hidden until crisis destroyed companies, and that loyalty meant protecting the organization's mission rather than protecting each other's egos. The Castellan division restructure was approved unanimously, the mentorship program funded generously, and the commitment was made that Thornton Technologies would create opportunities based on merit and potential, rather than connections or circumstances. Emma left the meeting feeling lighter than she had in months, because every decision she made now was aligned with her values rather than contradicting them. Every action was honest rather than manipulative. Every relationship was built on truth rather than careful omissions. The drive home took her past the apartment she'd shared with James, the building where she'd spent 3 years performing the role of struggling coder while secretly running a billion-dollar empire. And Emma felt nothing looking at those windows except relief that she'd never have to pretend again. Her new place was smaller but entirely hers, a penthouse she'd purchased under her legal name, with money she didn't have to hide, decorated with furniture she'd chosen without worrying about James's opinions, filled with baby items she'd selected based on safety and quality rather than price. The nursery was painted sage green with stars on the ceiling, a crib that met every safety standard, and shelves already filled with books about brave girls, strong women, and adventures that didn't require princes or rescue. Emma's final act of the day was writing a letter to her daughter, Words that wouldn't be read for years but needed to be written now while the lessons were fresh. My darling girl, by the time you read this, you'll know the story of how your father and I ended, but I want you to understand what it taught me so you don't have to learn it the hard way. Love isn't about making yourself smaller so someone else feels bigger. Partnership isn't about hiding your truth to protect someone's ego. Family isn't defined by blood, but by who shows up consistently with genuine care. I built an empire in secret because I was afraid that being powerful would make me unlovable, but the real lesson is that anyone who needs you to be less than you are doesn't actually love you. They love the version of you that serves their needs. Be brilliant, be bold, be exactly who you are, and trust that the right people will celebrate you rather than requiring your diminishment. Everything I built is yours, but more important than the wealth is this truth. You are enough, exactly as you are, and you never need anyone's permission to take up space in the world. Love, Mom. The letter went into the fireproof safe with estate documents and insurance policies, but the lessons went into Emma's heart as promises about the mother she'd become, the example she'd set, and the world she'd helped create where daughters didn't have to choose between success and love, between power and partnership, between being themselves and being accepted. The Martinez family was bankrupt and begging, but Emma was wealthy in ways that transcended money. Wealthy in self-knowledge and hard-won wisdom, in the freedom that comes from living in alignment with your truth, and in the anticipation of meeting the daughter who would never watch her mother hide. Dear viewers, you've just experienced a story about the price of hiding who you are and the power of reclaiming your truth. Emma's journey teaches us that genuine love doesn't require you to diminish yourself, that protecting someone from reality isn't kindness but enabling, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is set boundaries that force accountability. You've learned why financial independence matters, how building success in secret can become its own prison, and the importance of choosing partners who celebrate your strength rather than feeling threatened by it. The story demonstrates that revenge isn't always about destruction. Sometimes it's about removing your support and letting people experience the natural consequences of their choices. Now it's your turn to engage. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. What lesson from Emma's story resonated most deeply with you? If you were in her position, would you have revealed your identity sooner? Or would you have waited like she did? What would you have done differently when you discovered your partner's betrayal? How would you have handled a mother-in-law who treated you with such disrespect? Do you think Emma should give James another chance to be a father, or should she protect her daughter from his inconsistency? Share your perspective, your wisdom, and your own experiences with hidden identities, betrayal, or finding the courage to stop hiding who you really are. Subscribe to this channel for more powerful stories that challenge your assumptions, explore complex moral questions, and remind you that the people we underestimate often possess strength we cannot imagine. Hit that notification bell so you never miss content that entertains, educates, and inspires you to live more authentically and love more wisely.